Morning and welcome to Boston Like a Local. I'm your host, Pete. If this is your first time visiting this channel, please remember to give us a like or hit the subscribe button if you want to see other content in this series. Faneuil Hall is named for the Bostonian merchant Peter Faneuil. Faneuil was the child of French Protestants, also known as Huguenots, who left France in the late 17th century and early 18th century due to political strife. In particular, the French had revoked something called the Edict of Nantes, which allowed for Protestantism within French borders. When that edict was revoked, many Huguenots departed France, and Peter Faneuil's family relocated to the American colonies, where he was actually born. In his 20s and 30s, Peter Faneuil became fairly well off, although he only lived into his early 40s. In 1740, Peter Faneuil proposed building this marketplace for the city, free of cost. He proposed it as a gift. Despite the free offer, the city of Boston was not necessarily thrilled with the idea of putting a large market building here. At the time, in the early 18th century, market buildings often had a poor reputation, evidently because they were meant for people to rent stalls in so that they could hawk their wares, but what poorer sellers would do is simply cluster outside market buildings, making a lot of noise, trying to sell people their products. And so market buildings were considered a nuisance by many citizens. The Boston votership who were involved in allowing construction of this building were nearly split on whether or not to approve it, but it was narrowly approved by a few votes. The building was officially opened 2 years later in 1742. Now, the area of Boston where Faneuil Hall sits was originally part of an area called Dock Square. These days, in the early 21st century, the waterfront of the city is about 200 or 300 yards off in the direction I'm pointing. But at the time that this was constructed, the waterfront would have been much closer. And so there was an area called Bendel's Cove, which was one of the sites where ships would actually dock. And so this is a convenient location near the waterfront for the kinds of international trade that went on in Boston in the 18th century. Now, in the early 18th century, the kind of trade that Boston was involved in was known as the triangular trade. Goods and services were shipped here from England and from the rest of Europe. But there was also trade back and forth to the British colonies in the West Indies, down in the Caribbean. And that meant that there was also trade in slaves from West Africa. There were actually slave markets and slave auctions here in this area. And certainly many slaves were sold into slavery in the West Indies to work on the British plantations there. Bostonians were involved in that slave trade. There were slaves here in New England, but certainly many people who were involved in trade here in Boston had associates or family members who were involved in running plantations in the West Indies. So the wealth that flowed through Boston at this point in time was very heavily involved with the slave trade. And in fact, Peter Faneuil traded in slaves among other commodities. Historians will often tell you that the raw number of slaves in Massachusetts was never very large compared to other places in the British Empire. It was not as large a number as it became in the southern colonies in the United States or the southern states later on. The number of slaves was not as large as it was in the West Indies. However, Massachusetts was also the first of the mainland British colonies to practice slavery, despite the fact that it never became a very large part of the economy right here on Massachusetts land. It was a very, very significant part of Massachusetts's economy as part of the British Empire and part of the foundation of the wealth that went into this colony prospering. So ironically, Faneuil Hall is often identified as one of the cradles of liberty in the United States because many of the people who were in favor of revolution or of separating from the British Empire gave very powerful and passionate speeches about the rights of colonists to determine their own course. However, you could argue that Faneuil Hall is also one of the cradles of slavery, in the way that Boston as a whole is one of the cradles of slavery in the United States. So this is a National Historic Site, and it's also still a working marketplace, although mostly for tourist things. So let's go inside and take a look and see what we can find. There's shops on the first floor. We may be able to get up on the second. We'll find out. And if so, we'll see what's up there, which is an old meeting site.
Okay.
Looks like we're in luck. It looks like the Great Hall is open, although apparently I have to go outside to walk up there. So let's see what we find. morning. If you visit Boston, you'll find that Faneuil Hall is very centrally located. In fact, over my shoulder here, you can see the current Boston City Hall.